We're on the top of Daf Samach Gimel Amid Beis, and we're continuing with Rab Shimon ben Lakish, who says that you're Chayiv Malchus if you shech the Korban Pesach, or if you're Zorek the Korban Pesach, and you have Chometz in your possession. So that's either the Shochet or the Zorek. And now, O Echad Mibnei HaChabura. It's enough that one of the members of the registered group, that unit, is in possession of Chometz at the time of the Shechita or the Zrika, and that itself engenders a chiyuv of lo sishcha. And here we have a major machlokes regarding this lav of lo sishchat if one of the bnei chabura is holding on to Chometz. According to Rashi, the shochet and all the members of the chabura bichlal will violate the lav based on the fact that one member of the chabura is in possession of the Chometz. And Rashi indicates this in his Perish on Chumash in Parshas Ki Tisa. Tosfos, on the other hand, disagrees. Tosfos says that only that person who is in possession of Chometz at the time of the Shechita or the Zrika will violate the lav. The other Bnei Chabura are not guilty and cannot be held responsible for the fact that one of the Bnei Chabura has Chometz in his possession. You might have thought that maybe the shliach, meaning the shochet, is now serving as a shliach, shalom kimoso, and therefore he has like the same status as that one of the bnei chabura that has chametz. But Tos writes the bnei chabura, with the exception that one individual is holding on to chametz, are not included in the lav. Tosfos has one possibility that the shochet and the zorek, insofar as they're aware of the possession of Chometz on the part of one of the Bnei Chabura, would violate the law. Now Reish Lakish goes on, and he says, "V'ad shiahei imo be'azara." The possession of the Chometz only applies if the Chometz itself is in the Azara at the time of the Shechita, at the time of the Zrika. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, "Afal pi she'eno imo ba'azara." We have a machlokes between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. What happens in a case where the Chometz is in the possession of the Shochet, the Zorek, one of the Bnei Chabura, but it's not in the Azor? Reish Lakish holds you only violate al zivchi, meaning when it's right there in the Azor near the Shechita. That's where the Chometz cannot be allowed. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even if the Chometz is outside the Azara, anywhere in Yerushalayim for that matter, nevertheless, there will be a violation of Lo Sishcha. The Gemara now is going to analyze what is the machlokus all about. First, the Gemara investigates the possibility that the machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is a methodological machlokus that applies all over Tanakh whenever you see the word al. And be al b'samach kamifli. Reish Lakish savar al b'samach. Whenever the Torah says al, it means that there's physical proximity. And Rabbi Yochanan savar lo b'inan al b'samach. So when the Torah says lo sishchat al chametz, Reish Lakish understood that's al b'samach. Don't do the shechita when there's chametz in close proximity, and in this context it means anywhere in the Azor. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, holds no. We don't accept the principle of al b'samuch, and even if the chametz, as we said before, is anywhere in Yerushalayim, that's enough to incur the violation. So the Gemara thinks that since we have this tradition in which the Gemara quotes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan as arguing about what at this point we think is al b'samuch, the Gemara thinks that since we have a machlokus between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan elsewhere about al b'samuch, whether al is b'samuch or lo be'inan al b'samuch, why would the tradition transmit this machlokus a second time around? We have this as an old machlokus, which we would simply and logically apply to this case of ownership of chametz. And in order to appreciate the original machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding al, let's give a little bit of background. With regard to the hakrava of what's called lachmei toda, right? A person who experienced some sort of a salvation, he has to bring a carbon toda. And together accompanying the carbon toda are the lachmei toda. And halacha is that with the shchita of the carbon toda, the lachmei toda becomes sanctified for the mitzvah of the carbon toda. So the Torah says, "Vayikra Zayin al chalos lechem chometz yakriv karbano al zevach toda shlomav." Let's emphasize the word al. Isnan, and we have a Mishnah, Hashochet toda lifnim velachma michutz lechoma. He shechs the carbon toda, and that of course happens lifnim inside the azor. It always has to be in the azor. But the lachmei toda are outside of the azor. Lo kiddush halechem. The sanctification, what's called kiddush saguf of the lechem, which is engendered by the shchita asatoda, is not accomplished in this case when the lachmei toda are outside of the azor. My chutz lechoma. What does it mean? Where is it? The Mishnah in Masechta Menachos uses a very, very vague phrase. It says it's chutz lechoma. Rabbi Yochanan, let's skip for a moment Rabbi Yochanan. We'll come right back to Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish Amar, Reish Lakish says, chutz la'azara. Chomas ha'azara. When the Mishnah mentions the choma, it's referring to the chomas ha'azara. So that when the Torah says, according to Reish Lakish's reading, al zevach toda shlomim, al means that the lachmei toda are right there in the azara, right proximate to the shchita of the toda. That's Reish Lakish. Now we go back to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that chutz lechoma lo kiddush halechem means even if the lechamim are anywhere in Yerushalayim. Chutz lechoma means to exclude a case where they're outside the chomas Yerushalayim. And he calls it chomas beis pagi. Beis pagi is a place that's on the outskirts of Yerushalayim. In other words, according to Rabbi Yochanan, only when the lechem is outside of Yerushalayim, then at time of the shchita hatoda, then and only then do we apply the principle of kiddush halechem. Because al doesn't mean besamach. Chutz lechomas hazara kiddush below being an al besamach. Rabbi Yochanan holds that al means anywhere, as long as it's within the kedusha, the framework of Yerushalayim, where a carbon shlom has to be, then kiddush halechem. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Amar afilu chutz lechomas hazara lo kiddush. When the Mishnah says chutz lechoma lo kiddush, it means even if it's outside the chomas hazor. Alma be'inan al b'samach. Reish Lakish interprets al to mean in close proximity. So you have to get the lachmei toda in close proximity to the shchita, because as the pasuk reads, al chalos lechem chometz yakriv karbano al zevach toda shlomim. You need al b'samach. So the Gemara right now is perplexed if the machlokas here with regard to the ownership of Chometz at the time of shchita is the old machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about al b'samach, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan does not require al b'samach, and even if the Chometz is outside the azara, there will be a violation. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees vehemently with Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, says no. Al means b'samach. And the only time you would violate the law for shchita is if the Chometz is right there in the azar. So why did we need a tradition that would repeat that which we know? And just simply applying an old machlokas to this particular case. And therefore the Gemara wants to investigate another possible way of interpreting this machlokas, in which case it has nothing to do with al b'samach. Ela basra safek hamifli. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing, what is the status of asra safek? Is it a valid hasra? Is it not? Can we be mechayiv malchus for violating the hasra if it's only a safek? Can we not? So, for example, if the Chometz is in the Azora and it's staring us, glaring us in the face at the time of the Shechita, it's right there, that's called the Hasras Vada. And we say to the Shochet, if you go ahead and shech the carbon, in this case the Pesach, then you will definitely violate the Lavin and Karchi of Malchus. But if an event, the Chometz is not there in the Azor, we don't know where it is. Well, maybe we do know where it is, but we don't know if it's still there now. Maybe in the meantime, a dog ate it, or maybe some of the members of the household of the family ate it, who knows? And therefore, to give him Asra about the Shechita in the Azor when the Chometz is outside of the Azor, we don't know its status at this moment, that would be Asra Saf. And now we have another precedent machlokas regarding Hasra Safik between the same Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. It's an old machlokas. It's just repeating that which we know. The Itmar. So he took an oath that before the end of the day, before the sun sets, he'll eat this kikar. And every time we give him asra and we say, you better eat that kikar, or else you'll be violating the law, it's always asra suffix, because you never know what'll be 5 minutes later. He still has a little period of time and a buffer zone until he has to eat this kikar. So maybe he won't pay attention to the asra, but yet he has full intention and he will actually eat that kikar. There's another issue here, because in addition to having a suffix problem here, there's also a problem of what we call a lav she'ein bo maisa, because we're going to give malchus for what? For not eating the kikar. So Yochanan reina lokim yishum davi le'lav she'ein bo maisa. They call lav she'ein bo maisa lokin alav. Asra suffix, shma asra. Rav Shimon Lakish reina lokim yishum davi le'asra suffix, asra suffix lo shma asra, but lav she'ein bo maisa lokin alav. So there's a twofold machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Both agree that in this case of Shua Shochan Kikar Zayom, he will not get malchus. But the question is, why not? According to Rabbi Yochanan, he's not going to get malchus because it's a lav she'ein bo maisa. Rabbi Yochanan is not bothered, and he doesn't require asra asvada. As long as it's asra, and he's being forewarned that if you don't eat this kikar by hook or crook, you're going to get malchus. That would be asra. And it would be valid to get malchus, except for another problem. It's a lav she'ein bo maisa. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, says he's not bothered by lav she'ein bo maisa. You can get malchus even for a lav she'ein bo maisa, but you don't get malchus because this is hasra suffix. So once again, the Gemara is rejecting this interpretation of the machlokas insofar as it's an old machlokas and there's nothing new. So therefore, the Gemara swings back to its original pshat. Amri liolam bi'albis samacham miflagi. However, there is something very new about this machlokas, although it sounds like an old machlokas. Utzricha, we need this new machlokas with regard to the shechting of a korban pesach with chometz in the possession. And we also need the machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish about a case where he shechts the lachmei toda and the lachamim, he shechts the toda and the lachamim are nowhere to be found. They're not proximate. Diafligu, if we only had the machlokas about lo sishchal chometz dam zivchi, I would have said about who the kamer Rabbi Yochanan, the lo be'inan al b'samuch. Here, Rabbi Yochanan waives the requirement of al b'samuch, which he's going to insist on in the case of lachmei toda, and he's going to concede to Reish Lakish's possession in the Havmin if we didn't have another tradition explicitly arguing about lachmei toda. What would make Rabbi Yochanan claim that we require al b'samach except in the case of lo sichchat chametz al dam zivchi? How is that different than the kiddush of lachmei toda? Mishum de means chametz iserhu. V'chol heicha de isa. When the Torah says you're not allowed to shecht, that's an iser. It's a violation of a shechita. It's not a matter of creating something new. It's a matter of violating the Torah's prohibition. And in such a case, we assume that if it's after Zman Birur, and he should have gotten rid of all his chametz, he has violated an Isser. Now the Torah clamps upon him another Isser during the Shechita. So again, it's all one flow, one entity. The Torah says, get rid of your chametz. And we gave you until midday on the 14th. You didn't do so. You're already in violation of the mitzvah of Tashbisa. Possibly even Bal Yorah by Matzah, according to some. But certainly the Torah then goes ahead and says, you're in possession of Chometz, don't go ahead and check the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach and its preparation, its Shechita, is antithetical to your holding on to Chometz. So get rid of your Chometz. And if you don't, then you violate Lo Sishcha. And there, we're going to assume that since the halacha of bir chametz and the prohibition of possessing chametz, which emerges with midday on the 14th, includes a wide scope. All chametz, you can have chametz on the other side of the earth. You'll be violating this mitzvah of bir and possibly even bali rabbi matzeh. So the Torah now says, and you go ahead and shech the Korban Pesach. So here Rabbi Yochanan says is the exception to the rule of be'inon al b'som. Aval in migdash, when it comes to being makadosh the lechem, we're talking about lachmi toda through the shechita of the toda, lo kaddish ela bifnim, and the whole process of kiddush through the shechita of the tamid occurs and must occur inside the azara. Then Ema Modele, the Reb Shimon Lakish to be in al B'Sarach. Then certainly we have a strong logic that compels us to assume, like Reish Lakish, and Reb Yochanan would concede to Reish Lakish's position if we didn't have it explicitly, that we need B'Sarach. Why? The Isa Gavoy Kodesh Vilo Lo Kodesh. In other words, the Ma'aseh Shechita of the Toda is sanctifying, is generating the Kedusha and the Kiddush in the Lachnei Toda. Then the lachmi toda should be right there beside, and I'll prove it to you, says Gemara. There's a kiddush of kli sharetz, but it only applies when you pour something inside the kli, and the kli sharetz is makadosh the goof of that which you put inside the kli. But it's got to be inside the kli; it can't be somewhere who knows where, and therefore we would assume that Rabbi Yochanan would concede to Reish Lakish in this case. Be'inon al b'samach, because for the shechita of the toda to effectuate a kiddush of the lachmi toda, we need that it be b'samach. V'yashmin linon migdash lechem. Now, let's say we only had a tradition, and we only transmitted the machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the case of lachmi toda. Here, I would say that Reish Lakish is on the ball here. He says that which is intuitively the be'inon al b'sam, but we don't know what Reish Lakish would say about somebody who has possession of chametz in violation of the Torah's obligation of bir, and it's already the afternoon of the 14th, and now he goes ahead and checks the Korban Pesach. Maybe Reish Lakish would concede to Rabbi Yochanan that in this case he violates the law, and we don't need al b'sam. Hava mina b'hachka Reish Lakish to be in al b'samuch in the case of kiddush halechem of lachmi toda de'i sagavai kaddish lo kaddish. We need that the lachmi toda accompany, so to speak, in close proximity in the azara the shechita of the korban tamid in order to sanctify the lachmi toda. V'le'inyan Chometz modelei Rabbi Yochanan. We would think, and I have a meaning that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would be eye to eye. And Reish Lakish would certainly concede to Rabbi Yochanan the lo be'inon al b'samach. Why should we require al b'samach? The Isura who has violated an Isur of owning chametz. Because hecha the Isa, wherever the chametz is, he is violating the Isur of owning chametz. And therefore, when he shechs the Korban Pesach, that's the critical moment in which he violates the Isur of owning chametz. And it doesn't matter whether the chametz is with him in the Azara or outside the Azara Tzricha. And therefore, we need this machlokes. The Mefarshim want to know, how could it possibly be that there would be a Havamina according to Reish Lakish, that the reason why we need Al B'Samach is because it's a question of Isura and so forth and so on. I'm sorry that we don't need Al B'Samach. How could that be? I mean, what do we do with Hasra Safek? Boy mine Rav Oshia me Rabbi Ami. What's the halacha in a case where the shochet doesn't have any chametz? One of the members of the chabura has chametz. Does the shochet violate the iser of lo sishchat? And the Shita of Reish Lakish beforehand seems to be that it's a double pashut that the shochet violates chametz b'rshuso shel b'nei achabura. We just had Reish Lakish. That's how we started this amud. But Rav Oshia apparently didn't accept Reish Lakish, or at least he didn't think it was so pashut that the shochet would violate the Isa Lo Sishcha because of the ownership of one of the Bnei Achabura. Amalei. So Rav Ami says to Rav Oshia, Miksiv, does it say Lo Sishchat al Chamtzecha? It's your chametz. Don't shecht it because it's your chametz and you possess it. That's not what it says. It says Lo Sishchat al Chametz Ksiv. And that means chametz the alma, meaning if there's any chametz in possession, you violate the Isur Shchita. Otherwise, it should have said Chemtzecha in the possessive form. Hamalei Rav Oshia says to Rav Ami, are you going too far? Are you telling me that chametz means any chametz? So there's some Jew who's, he's out in, I don't know, he's in California, so there's a difference of 10 hours or 11 hours in time. So you're going to tell me because he owns chametz, I can't check it here in the Azara? Amalei, so Rav Ami has to defend himself. And he's got to limit it to the Bnei Achabura. How? In one verse, the Torah prohibits the shchita and bal tolit, which means not to leave the basar of the Pesach over beyond its allotted time for eating. And since they're both written in the same pasuk, it's telling you that whose chametz are we dealing with in the Reisha? The chametz of he who is nitfas, he's included in bal tolit. When the chametz is owned by hanach de kaimi alei mishum lo yom, and who would be violating bal yom? Only those who are members of the chabura. They have to make sure that the korban pesach is eaten within its allotted time. Somebody who's not a member of the chabura, he's not included in that Isur bal tolin, and if so facto, his chametz, even if he possesses it at the time of the shechita, is not going to generate an Isur lav on the shochet. Rav Papa Hilkah. Rav Papa says, you know what? Based on this analysis of Rav Ami, we should draw a very fascinating conclusion. If you're telling me that who's included in the possession of the chametz for the violation of Lo Sishchat is anyone who's included in Bal Yolin, then let's take it a step further. Let's discuss which actions of the Avodas HaKorban are prohibited when there's chametz in possession. Not only is shchita and zrika generating the Isur of al chametz, but there should be an Isur al chametz even at the Haktorah of the chalavim of the Korban Pesach. Why? Because that mitzvah of Haktorah's chalavim is the flip side of Bal Yolin. If you don't do the Haktorah on the chalavim, then there'll be a violation of Bal Yolin. Ho v'yeshno bichlal halonasi murid. So just like the shochet is enjoined from shechting when there's chametz in the rishus of one of the bnei chabura, so too the maktir, which is a different kohen, he's in charge of being maktir the chalavim of the chametz of the korban pesach. So too, if there's ownership of a chametz, then there is an asharas halah. Now, in this case, the Mefarshim say that according to Rav Papa, and the Gemara is going to support Rav Papa, it means that the maktir, the kohen maktir, has possession over chametz. It's no longer relevant as far as the bnei achabur is concerned. Again, that is a very fascinating point. Tanya Kavosei de Rav Papa, Hashocheres HaPesach al chametz over belosa, emosai, Bisman shachametz hu lashochet o lazorek o liechad mibnei chabura. So far, so good. This is exactly a sum of what we've been understanding from the start of this amud when we presented Reish Lakish's shita. Hoya liechad b'sofa olam ein zakiklo. It's irrelevant to the shochet or to the zorek as to who somewhere on the face of the globe is in possession of Chometz, it's got to be li'echad b'nei chabura, or the shochet himself, or the zorik himself. And then the Brisa concludes with a general statement, which is most critical to support Rav Papa. Echad hashochet, echad hazorik, v'echad hamaktir chaya. Like Rav Papa, we said that if you're maktir al Chometz, you violate this law. Now, the Brisa continues and wants to define the nature of shchita. Hamolikas ha'of. In molikas ha'of, in, let's say, for example, chatas ha'of, the molika is a substitute for shchita. And if, let's say, there would be on Erev Pesach after chatzos a chatas ha'of, and we may have such a case if you recall the sugya of mechutza kapara, would there be a violation for the molek if there's possession of chametz? And the Brisa says no. And we're not exactly sure why, but the premise here of this Brisa seems to be that malika is not the same as shchita. The Torah specifies lo sishchat al chametz. And at this point, the Gemara would assume that, you know what? Although generally speaking, we don't shecht a chatos on Erev Pesach, and certainly not after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim in the afternoon, but in a case of Malika Sa'of, that could be permissible, and that would not be a violation of Hashlama. Uramini, and now the Gemara is going to quote a stira, because we have another brayso that says Hashochet es haPesach al Chometz over below saseh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af hatamid, and we mentioned this before that Rabbi Yehuda expands the use of shchita beyond the confines of carbon pesach to include the carbon tamid. If you have chametz in your possession at the time of shchita carbon pesach, that's a violation. Amru lo, and the Chacham respond and argue against Rabbi Yehuda. Lo amru ela b'pesach bilvad. We don't apply the Isav Lo Sichchat to any other carbon other than carbon pesach. Amosai. Now the Brisa continues and asks, at what point is there a violation of this law? Bizman sheyesh la shochet or la zorek or li echad b'nei chabura. Olam ein zochah. As we said, we don't have to be concerned with someone else that's on the other side of the earth. The echad ha-shochet, the echad ha-zorek, the echad ha-molek. This Brisa explicitly goes on record as saying that in the chatas ofer there's no shchita but rather malika. Then, and that was the case of Mechusar Kapara, then there's a violation of the law by owning chametz against the original Brisa. So the Gemara is going to have to analyze this machlokas, whether or not malika is like shchita and included in the law or not. The Brisa continues and says, V'yachra mazeh chayav. In other words, if someone is in charge of hazas hadam on the mizbeach, once again, the lav will apply. And we don't know exactly why he would violate the lav if he's just being mazeh. Hazah is something that refers to the chatas oath that we mentioned before. And the pasuk says in Vayikra Hey Vehiza Midam HaChatas, and it's called Hazah because what they do is they grab the oath after Malika and they do Hataza on the Mizbech, and that Hataza is called in the Torah language Hazah. So both in Chatas Oath, both the Molek and the Mazeh are culpable for owning of Chometz. Aval, when it comes to Minachos, HaKometz es HaMincha, if let's say during the Moed, when at least according to Rav Shimon, as we'll see, there is a violation of the Lav Lo Sishchat with the possession of the Chometz, so during the Moed, that would only apply to Zvachim, but not to Minachos. And although Kmitza is the equivalent of Zrika in Zvachim, Kmitza in Minachos, but nevertheless, I know over Velosas. And Hamaktir Murim, if a person is in charge of Haktarsi Murim on the 14th of the Korban Pesach or of other Zvachim during the Moed, Eino over Belotas. So we have a double stira now, as the Gemara points out here on the top of Samach Gimel, Amid Al Kasha, Malika Amalika, Vikasha Haktora Ahaktora. The first price says that Malika Sa'of Ala Chometz is pot. Second price says he's Chaim. Then we have another kasha stira in Haktora. The first price says that a makter Ala Chometz is Chaim, and the second price says that a makter Ala Chometz is pot. The Gemara points out now that there's an inner stira here within the price itself. Uletamech. You're questioning a stira, a conflict between two brises. Tikshalucha higufa. Second brise itself seems to contradict itself. The Katani, at the beginning of the brise, it says that the Chacham turned to Rabbi Yehuda, and they said, Lo Amru, Ella, Be Pesach, Bilvad, not in Shar Karbonos. And then Hadar Tani, in the Sefer, the same second brise, it says, Echad HaShochet, V'echad HaZorik, V'echad HaMolik, V'echad HaMaz. And Malik and Azal only apply to Chatas HaOf, so we're talking about other Karbonos. So the Reish of the brise contradicts the Sefer. Ella, but rather you're going to have to say that we can reconcile the steer between these two brises and say, both brises. Rabbi Shimon reflect the sheet of Rabbi Shimon, who says that on Shar Karbonos, you are potter if you shechted ala chametz on the 14th. But yet he says that in the same scenario where you shechted other Karbonos during the Moed, during Pesach, and you are in possession of chametz, you do violate the law. So therefore, Malika Malicha Lokasha, Kan Be'arbasar, Kan B'chol Shel Moed, V'idi Rabbi Shimoni. When the Brisa Rishona says that you are potter from Malika, that's because we're talking on our basar. On our basar, there's only a chiyuv for Korban Pesach, and that's true in the ratio of the second Brisa as well. Lo Omru El Pesach Bilvad, because we're talking about the 14th of Nisan. So again, Rabbi Shimon says you're not chai for the 14th Nisan except in the Korban Pesach situation. But Khan, the Sefer of the second Raisa, is talking about Malika B'chol Shel Moed, during the Moed itself. And therefore you're chai according to Reish Lakish on Malika. So the final conclusion here is that Malika is equivalent to Shchita and generates the law. Aktor Nami Lokash. Now we can answer the second contradiction. Both brisos reflect the shita of Rabbi Shimon. Te'ikar de makdish haktora l'shchita. According to the first briso, within the framework of Rabbi Shimon, there is a hekesh between haktora and shchita, and therefore haktora is subject to the same lav of lo sishcha. This hekesh is based on a pasuk. In Shmos Chav Gimel, it says, Lo Sizbach al Chometz Sam Zivchi, V'lo Yolin Chelev Chagiat Boker. And this teaches us that just like the Shochet is enjoined from Shechting al Chometz, so to the Maktir is enjoined from Shechting al Chometz. So he commanded Lo Makish. The second Tana did not accept that Hekesh, and that's why he holds that the Maktir is not subject to any violation of the law for the possession of Chometz. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop at Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Thank you very much.